At the end of 216 BC, while Hannibal was busy in Campania, two letters arrived in Rome. One from Sicily and one from Sardinia, each more brimstone alarming than the other. The letter from Sardinia alleged that the legions were infected with the Rona and needed some Fauci ouchies now, while the local population themselves were a mystery meat mix of barbarians and Punics. The Sicilian letter was about how the legions were running out of food and money and were experiencing rebellions in small Greek colonies on the island. The praetor of Sicily said that the only reason they were still hanging on is because Hiero, the king of Syracuse, who was an old god ally of Rome for 50 years, was helping out the legions with food. The Senate deliberated and decided on the following actions for the year 215, which was about to start. Sicily was a frontier province. Number one, it allowed Rome to easily raid the Carthaginian coast with gay BBC gifts, while also serving as a shield, denying Punic navy access to mainland Italy, and therefore denying Hannibal any serious reinforcements. They didn't know that Carthage was not gonna send Hannibal anything anyway. Sicily, being a frontier region and all that, housed Rome's best troops. But because the Senate believed that Hiero would live for infinity years, they decided that Sardinia required more urgent action. Also, Hiero's son, Gelo, who was eyeing an alliance with Carthage and was quietly helping the Greek city-states to rebel, died completely on his own, with no foul play, when a naturally occurring anvil fell on his head, absolutely accidentally. If you don't believe me and don't buy that his death was from natural causes, you can ask the Cannae family. They know all about natural deaths. The Senate did, however, withdraw the Sicilian legions back to Italy, and sent the survivors of Cannae, who were at that time under Marcellus, into a sort of exile there. Marcellus, meanwhile, was tasked with raising two new legions to replace the Cannae veterans, who were now being sent to Sicily. Now, on to Sardinia, they sent Titus Manlius Tarquatus, who you may remember as the Senate's resident janitor, who refused to ransom 8,000 Roman prisoners from Hannibal because they broke rules or something. He was a censor, so quite literally a janny. By this time he was quite old, but by Jupiter, if there was anything he knew how to do, it was sweeping it and cleaning it up. So he was perfect for dealing with trash in Sardinia, and he would do it for free as well. Meanwhile, some shit literally no phono cares about was going on in Bruttium, the tip of Italy's boot. But just ignore that, it's of no consequence. It just isn't, okay? Now let's talk about the appointments for 215, because this is a weird year. Roman elections for the next year's consuls were held in summer, probably July. Naturally, two consuls were elected in July of 216 for the year 215. These were Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus and Lucius Postumius Albinus. Remember him? He was ambushed and decapitated by the Boii tribe 3 episodes ago. Okay, now this event occurred in August of 216, shortly after Cannae, but Livius, in his retelling of this story, tells us this information as if it reached Rome just days before the consuls for 215 were to take office. And I find it hard to believe that it would take months for this disaster to reach Rome. Either way, the point is that Senate dragged their feet when it came to holding elections for a replacement for Albinus. Mostly because the obvious replacement was Marcellus, who, just like Gracchus, was a plebeian, and the Senate did not want their little circle jerk intruded upon by two plebeian consuls. So they came up with many ways to keep Marcellus out of the city, so he couldn't stand for election. And this is why they sent him to raise new legions to replace his Cannae veterans instead of just giving him the Sicilian troops. In winter, instead of going back to Rome, Marcellus was forced to find and train new recruits. The Senate wanted time, so someone of patrician stock would distinguish themselves in the field and be a suitable alternative to Marcellus. Now, they obviously had Fabius Maximus, but some senators were still seething at him for his delaying tactics and would rather elect anyone else. Well, that anyone else didn't come. So at the tail end of 216, they were forced to hold elections, and Marcellus obviously won. He was super popular due to his victory at Nola. The Senate clitty was not only leaking, but absolutely gushing at this development. Two plebeian consuls were simply not acceptable. They sneeded and feeded as much as they could, but there was no political action they could take. However, there was a religious one. Well, there wasn't one, but you can always make some bullshit up, right? Before Marcellus could assume office, some priests ran to the forum and announced that Uranus was leaking red strings of liquid or something. I don't know, I wasn't there. But they said that this meant that the gods themselves didn't want 2 plebeian consuls. The people, being brain dead as always, ate this up, and Marcellus's election was nullified. Fabius, consistently being the smartest person in the room, offered to take Marcellus's place, and the Senate, not having anyone better, agreed. A small analysis I can offer you of these events is that, to me, the patrician class was so incapable of holding off Marcellus's election directly because of Cannae. As you may or may not know, the election process for the consuls and praetors heavily favored the rich and their chosen candidates, which, by the way, is not necessarily a bad thing, and eventually I'll get into why in a different video. Or maybe perhaps even a stream even? I don't know. The problem with this system at this point, however, was that the Roman equites and the rich died en masse at Cannae, giving those darn poors more electoral power. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that Cannae may have been actually good for Rome, as it cleared out an oligarchy that was getting ready to entrench itself, and thus gave way to more meritocratic appointments. A silver lining, if you will. I know I will. At the start of the spring, the new consuls ceremoniously left Rome and rejoined their legions in Campania. Tiberius took over 2 legions that were made up of willing slaves, gladiators, criminals, and conscripted allies. Fabius took over the Sicilian legions, and Marcellus, now a proconsul, took charge of the 2 new legions he had raised. All in all, in southern Italy, Rome had about 100,000 troops, both allied and Latin, in 3 different armies. Hannibal had 60,000 men, 40 under him and 20 in Brutium, under a general named Hanno, who was Hannibal's nephew, by the way. The generals soon received the only reinforcements they would get from Carthage: 40 elephants and 4,000 Numidian horsemen. Out of the 3 Roman armies lurking on our Hannibal in Campania, Tiberius was clearly the weakest link, as Fabius was in charge of veteran legions and Marcellus had already beaten Hannibal once. Gracchus, on the other hand, was in charge of a mud army made up of slaves from all over the Mediterranean, sometimes even needing interpreters to communicate. Now, such a Brazilian legion is clearly a recipe for disaster. However, Tiberius loved everyone and everything, including gross creatures like Greeks or Thracians or whatever that were in his army. He knew that diversity was our strength, you fucking chud. So in reality, he had the strongest legions with him. With just some love and compassion, he would #StopHate. The fact that Tiberius was of plebeian ancestry made him more relatable to his men. Every day he would train with them and order his Roman tribunes to not treat the mystery meat horde any differently. This was very effective, and essentially made it so that his 2 legions were actually his 2 legions. His personal army, if you will. And if you won't, I will. They worked together and fought together not because they loved each other, but because they loved Gracchus. Being satisfied that he de-Brazilified his army, Tiberius crossed the Volturnus and headed towards Cumae, where he had gotten reports of upcoming Carthaginian activity. You see, the Capuans, eager to prove to their new Punic masters that they were good golems, were organizing a little devilish scheme. Now, Livius doesn't precisely mention who was concocting this plan, but when it comes to Capua and scheming, we know who our usual suspect would be. Of course, none other than Pacavius Calavius. Keep in mind, I am completely making it up that it was him behind this, but hey, who's going to stop me? Hannibal may have taken over Capua and most of Campania, but he still had no port, and therefore no access to the sea. He tried 2 times to take over the town of Neapolis, but failed both times. Another town that had access to the sea was Cumae. Calavius wanted to give this town to his new master. However, the Italians were terrible at warfare, but they were good at tricks, so Calavius came up with one. Capuans pretended to hold some sort of a festival nearby and invited all Campanian towns to attend, but especially invited the pro-Roman aristocracy of Cumae. I'm sure I don't have to explain the rest of the plan, right? Upon receiving the invitation, the Cumaeans, Cumers went straight to Tiberius, who promptly told them to RSVP to the party, but not go. A classic move that I bet all my antisocial chuds out there appreciate very much. When the Capuans got a positive response to their invitation, they let their guards down, thinking that they had the Cumae aristocracy in the bag. 40,000 Capuans were laying in ambush outside of the festival grounds. But when the Cumaeans didn't show up, instead of getting suspicious, like anyone with a brain would, they just decided that nothing was going to happen and started attending the festivals themselves. I mean, hold on, I gotta hand it to the Capuans here. It's not every day that you see someone fall into their own trap. That's some Looney Tunes slop right there. Well, the Sicilians got busy drinking, not realizing that Tiberius was just around the corner with his mystery meat legion. Gracchus gave the signal. His own personal army rushed into the festival grounds and simply decimated the Italians. The entire 40,000 strong army vanished in half an hour. Most of them eventually made it back to Capua, but this little encounter showed to Hannibal how useless the Italians were. Speaking of Hannibal, he didn't know about this entire thing at all, by the way. He was only informed of the plan after it failed. A rare Pacuvius L, if you'll allow me to point it out. I mentioned silver linings before, and Hannibal was especially good at seeing them. Instead of acknowledging the fact that his newest and biggest allies were complete retards who just lost their entire army to a slave horde, Hannibal realized that Tiberius's men were probably very proud of themselves after the victory and might actually try their luck against the main Carthaginian army now if given the chance. So he set off from his camp near Capua towards the festival grounds with such haste that his soldiers only brought their weapons with them. Hannibal was right in his assumption that the slave army was now ready to fight even the gods if given the opportunity, but he did not account for Gracchus having a control rod for his golems. As I mentioned, Tiberius had mastered the art of golem management, an art form that Carthaginians until now considered to be their specialty. Gracchus third-wrangled his army and managed to get them to back off and encamp behind the walls of Cumae. Despite this, Hannibal was so fast to react that if he wanted to, he could try an assault. But as I mentioned, his soldiers only had their weapons with them. It would have been an extremely risky decision to assault Cumae at this point. And to be honest here, and give credit where credit is due, Hannibal was a genius. So he obviously didn't commit to this. He waited a day or two for his baggage train to arrive and then set up a siege camp. Now, would you be surprised if I told you that Hannibal, who I have just declared a genius, would fall for the same thing that he fell for first at Nola and then at Casilinum? Well, he didn't. Haha, I have just tricked you into thinking that he did. In fact, he was the one who pulled the surprise attack on the Romans this time. What was supposedly a building of a siege camp was actually a building of a siege tower. Tiberius was getting ready for a long siege, but he gulped a comical cartoonish gulp once he realized that Hannibal had a tower to assault the walls with. But I'd like to remind you, dear viewer, diversity is our strength, and diversity, which is our strength by the way, coupled with Roman engineering autism, is a deadly weapon. Gracchus whipped up his own personal army, and they managed to build a tower of their own, which they would obviously use to have better access to wherever the breach may have been. Now let's zoom out here a bit. You might remember that there were 3 Roman armies in the field: Marcellus, Tiberius, and Fabius. Now you might be asking, what were Marcellus and Fabius doing while Hannibal was out in the open with his back to them? Now brace for it, because the answer will shock you. They were busy doing nothing. Okay, let's be fair to Marcellus here, because his army was fresh AF, but Fabius on the other hand had experienced and drilled legions and was directly behind Hannibal. Now I'm always the one to be on the side of my Latin Fabius here. I mean, look at him. He's so defiant. How can he be wrong? Well, ever. But this time I think my Rex dropped his crown a little bit. And I know I'm not the only one thinking this here, because here's what Livius has to say about Fabius's inactivity. Fabius was engaged with a succession of ominous events, which were being reported to him. He took the usual steps to neutralize these portents, but the soothsayers continued to announce that the entrails of sacrificial victims indicated nothing but ill luck. Grr. Now, I'm not here to make a Redditor point about how Le Religion is less stupid, but "the crows are shitting blue poops" is a great and convenient excuse for not doing anything, and Fabius would not shy away from using it. This actually highlights an important character trait of Fabius that would become more and more damaging to the war effort as the years passed by. Maximus was a little too rigid in his belief of do nothing, win, while other generals like Marcellus, for example, would use the Fabian strategy to create opportunities for themselves that could potentially lead to Hannibal's defeat. But we'll get to that in due time, my dear soy tinks. Don't you worry about that. All this was just to say that Gracchus was alone. As the Carthaginian tower approached the walls, it was quickly set on fire by Tiberius's men. When the Punics got busy trying to put out the fire, the Roman mystery meat army rushed out of the gate and attacked from the flanks. So Hannibal did fall for it again, and I have just double-tricked you. But to be fair here, it wasn't his fault. He did set up his men to guard the town gates against a potential sally. But them being barbarians and all, they were surprised and shocked by the sudden fire, like the cavemen they were. Another L in siege warfare for Hannibal, as he abandoned the town by next morning and made his way back to Capua. Now Fabius crossed the Alternus and headed towards Marcellus to, do nothing there maybe, the sources aren't clear. Marcellus decided that the doingness of nothing in this region was already wholly monopolized by Fabius, so he packed up his camp and went to Nola, and from there he would send raiding parties into Samnium, which was another Italian region that allied with Carthage. And here the differences between Marcellus's Fabian strategy and Fabius's Fabian strategy become apparent. Hannibal was one man with one army that the Romans could not deal with. However, everywhere else Rome was doing okay at the very least. So it would stand to reason that as long as you avoid battle with Hannibal, you can actually do whatever you want. Students of the Napoleonic era are probably getting a chubby right now. Anyway, that's what Marcellus was doing. He knew Hannibal couldn't be everywhere at once. So if he was forced into Samnium, the Romans would take over Campania. If Hannibal stayed in Capua, then Samnium would fall. But Hannibal was Hannibal, and so he knew exactly how to respond. But before that, until I tire you out with battle slop, let's talk about some politics slop, the happening at Cannae and shockwaves throughout the known world. Well, the relevant parts of it at least. Macedonia was one such relevant part. The king, Philip V, really wanted to LARP as Alexander, and was really insecure about the fact that some Italian upstart city-state was emerging as the new global power. It was Macedonians who was gangs after all, not Romans. So as soon as he heard about Cannae, he jumped at the opportunity to rat fuck Rome and immediately sent envoys to Hannibal. This was obviously done in secret, so the delegation disembarked on a random beach where they thought they would not be noticed. As if all of it was bad comedy, they ran face first into a Roman praetor, who asked them what the fuck they were doing exactly. Keeping up with the bad comedy theme, the Macedonian envoys turned beet red, pulled their colors, gulped, and made up the stupidest lie possible. We are here on this abandoned beach because we just wanted to go to the Senate and tell them how much we love Rome and how definitely we are not planning on opening up another front.
I think you're right.
Now, believe it or not, this Bugs Bunny tier lie worked, and the praetor let them go. and even told them where Hannibal was, just so they could avoid him. The envoys quickly struck a deal. Philip was to set sail to Italy with the biggest fleet possible, help Carthaginians conquer the peninsula, which would remain in Punic hands, and then both would sail back to Greece and help Philip take over the Hellenic world. What a fantastic deal, huh? Except on their way back, the delegation ran out of their cartoon luck and were imprisoned by the Romans. The Senate heard of this deal before Philip did. They quickly started making preparations. However, one ship of the Macedonian envoys managed to escape and made its way back to Philip, who promptly asked them what the agreed upon deal was. He was greeted with nothing, because the guys that managed to escape did not know the details of the alliance. Philip then asked them what the fuck they were doing back in Macedon if they didn't have the deal with them. To which the envoys replied with a shrug, a gulp, and the iconic look into the camera. You think this whole thing is a cartoon? Hold on, you haven't heard all of it yet. Philip sent the envoys back to Hannibal, and this time they came back with the deal. But it took them so long that the winter had come, and the Macedonian involvement was not only delayed for a year, but Romans had already set up a new fleet in the Adriatic to counter any Greek spurge out. That's all, folks. Now let me tell you something. The events I just relayed to you would start a conflict known as the First Macedonian War, which is something that not only no phono cares about, but even I don't care about. It's just some Greeks slap fighting each other over who says prostagma the loudest, while Rome watches from the Adriatic, so expect no further mention of it from now on. The only reason I told you of this is because, well, eventually we will get to Rome curb-stomping Philip, so I wanted to establish at least some context, but the main reason is that the fleet that Rome commissioned for the Adriatic actually broke them financially. Think about it. Rome was waging war in southern Italy against Hannibal, northern Italy against Gauls, in Sicily against Greeks, in Sardinia against rebels, and in Spain against rest of Carthage. Not to mention the constant naval war going on in the Mediterranean. Now, add another frontier in Greece against a kingdom that has huge military infrastructure, and you have a complete financial disaster on your hands, if not a military one. It really is Jupiter's miracle that Rome survived all this through sheer will, anger, and seethe. The fleet commissioned for the Adriatic was 40 ships. That's something to scoff at. Don't quote me on this, but that probably cost the same as a few extra legions. Now, as soon as the order was given to build a new navy, a letter arrived from Spain. The Scipio brothers wanted money. Now, I don't think you'll be surprised to find out that the Iberian front was the only front of the war where Romans were consistently winning. So no matter how hard the Senate didn't want to send money to the Scipios, they simply had to. Rome was forced to give itself over to debtors, or I guess creditors if you want to be pedantic about it. Now I know what most of you are thinking, you bad boys, and the answer is no, because they weren't in Europe yet. So this isn't a Waterloo situation, but Rome did have to take risks that could eternally destroy it financially if it failed. They borrowed money from cities' wealthy businessmen and merchants. Isn't it funny how a state can be in a legitimate existential crisis and it will still have to borrow money from its own citizens? You know, citizens that themselves would lose everything if the state lost? There's just something about wealth and money that transcends absolutely everything. And this is not a commie rant, by the way, I'm just making an observation. Well, the creditors approached the Senate and demanded two things. One, that they would be exempt from military service, and two, if the ships carrying gold and goods to Spain be sunk, either by the enemy or by weather, the state should accept the risk and pay them back with its own assets. And thus collateral was invented. Speaking of Spain, Livius says that after the money and the goods arrived, the Scipii brothers defeated the Barcid brothers Mago and Hasdrubal in two separate battles, one at Iliturgis and one at Intibili, saving the local Spanish quote-unquote allies from certain destruction. Saving the Hispanitards, especially ones at Iliturgis, would be a grave mistake. Okay, let's go back to the financial burden back home, or back Rome, if you'll be so kind to excuse the pun. You see, debt maxing might be a good way to temporarily solve your financial crisis, but in the long run, you need measures. Measures that would stop excessive spending. Measures that would bring austerity and fiscal responsibility. But most importantly, measures that would stop women who be shopping. Enter Marcus Oppius. Challenging times have their own silver linings. Most of the time that is a good hard reality check, a slap across the face that brings you back down to earth and reminds you of how insignificant you truly are. The Battle of Cannae played that role for Rome, and Marcus Oppius played this role for Roman women. Now, frugality is a cornerstone of Roman identity, so the actions of Marcus Oppius could not really be blamed wholly on inceldom, but they were based nonetheless. In fact, Stephen. Marcus Oppius got the Senate to pass laws that forbade Roman women from not only possessing wealth, but also displaying it. If any of you have ever known a woman, you can probably guess how much this probably hurt them. They also weren't allowed to own more than an ounce of gold, they weren't allowed to wear extravagantly colored clothing, and they weren't allowed to use animal-drawn carriages unless the trip was longer than a mile. Imagine the absolute seethe that a roasty feels when Z isn't allowed to flaunt their property and wealth mug other roasties. Must have been interesting times. Oppian laws remained in effect for 20 years. Nay, 20 good years I should say. Until they were repealed by gross beta simps. But Cato the Elder put up a great fight trying to keep them in place. Maybe one day we'll even get to talk about that. Maybe. Now back to our regularly scheduled battle slop. This time in Sardinia. Can't forget about our resident Janny, can we? Sardinia was an important province. It provided a lot of grain and tax money to Rome. And as we have discussed, money was a big issue in the Eternal City. Sardinia could not be lost. The problem here was that the population of Sardinia was mostly Punic, as it had been only 20 years since it became a Roman province. So not much time to commit demographic shenanigans. In 215, when news of Cannae reached Sardinia, the local Punic SLOP people decided it was as good a time as any to go back to their infant-eating ways. The men in charge of this little revolt would be a schizophrenic noble named Hamsicora and his fat son, Hiostus. Last episode I mentioned that Carthage sent an expeditionary force of 12,000 soldiers under Hasdrubal the Bold, from now on referred to as Hasdrubald, to the island to help it rebel. However, Neptune was feeling a little impish, so he drifted them off to the Balearic Islands, buying Titus the Janny much needed time. As I mentioned, the Roman legions on the island were sick with the Rona, but Titus flattened the curve in 2 weeks by double vaxing, triple boosting, and quadruple masking them up and marching them off to the heart of the rebellion, Cornus, Hamsicora's hometown, which was defended only by the fat retard Hiostus, because his father was in northern Sardinia gathering troops. Now it is unknown why Hiostus decided to march out and meet Titus in the field, as he neither had Carthaginian backing yet, nor the support of his father. But that is what he did. Maybe because he was fat and retarded, who knows? Not me, that's for true. Titus's vax-maxed troops, roid-raging from their Fauci-ouchie injections, absolutely annihilated Hiostus's army in the field, killing 3,000 Sardinians and taking 800 hostages. Titus would have continued his ban streak and taken Cornus, but it just so happened that Hasdrubal and Hamsicora both arrived at this point. "Not on my board!" shouted Titus, and turned his legions around to face the enemy. Romans numbered around 20 to 25,000, while the Carthago-Sardinian army was somewhere between 25 to 30,000. The battle lasted for a mere 4 hours. The Sardinians, surprising absolutely no one, broke from their lines as soon as the Romans so much as yelled at them, but the Carthaginian line stood firm. Something hilarious happened in this battle, by the way. The Roman cavalry actually won on the flanks, wheeled around and hit the Punic rear, sealing the fate of the rebellion. Must be that Janny discipline, huh? 12,000 Carthaginians and Sardinians were slain on the field of battle, and 4,000 taken prisoner. Among them, Hasdrubal herself, who disappears from history after this, so it's safe to say that their hair never regrew. More importantly, among the dead was Hiostus, who probably died from a stroke because he was fat. Hearing of their son's death, Hamsicora committed suicide. All that was left for Titus was some light sweeping. He toured around Sardinia, taking extra hostages, punishing rebels, gathering tributes, and harvesting grain. He then sailed back to Rome and disbanded the 4 legions which were under his command. Then he went to the Senate and gave them all the slaves, tributes, hostages, and grain he took from Sardinia. So he literally, unironically, did it for free, everyone. In a previous episode, I speculated that he may have opposed the ransoming of Roman prisoners of Cannae because the Senate was already paying to buy slaves from rich Romans, and that perhaps he was one of those rich men. But I think I have to rethink my position on that one now. Thus our detour to Sardinia comes to an end, for now that is. Now let us march and sail back to Campania. As I last mentioned, Marcellus was busy sending raiding parties into Samnium to get Hannibal to either abandon Campania or abandon the Samnites. The tactic was initially successful, as the panicked Samnites sent an envoy to Hannibal that immediately started bitching. "We are being ravaged by Romans, you must help, yet we have not seen any aid. Why does the great Hannibal not act, huh?" It is as if it was Marcellus who wanted Cannae and not Hannibal. A really low-tier attempt to play off of Hannibal's ego, which did not work. Hannibal replied, "You report, ask for help, and complain in the same sentence. Maybe I am going to send you help. Why are you bitching?" Oh, sorry, are you? "No, fuck you," said Hannibal, and yet again showing his tactical superiority, once more refused to play the Roman game. He neither stayed in Campania nor went to help the Samnites. He marched for Nola. Again, my dear viewer, it was almost impossible to put Hannibal in a reactionary position. He always had the initiative, and it was always the Romans who were playing his game. This tactical and strategic advantage often goes overlooked when analyzing the successes of Hannibal, but this man had an almost supernatural ability to hold on to the initiative. So I'll use this opportunity to mention that. Consider it mentioned. While the Carthaginian army made their way back to Nola, Hanno, Hannibal's nephew, joined up with them, with his 20,000 men, bringing their combined strength up to 50 to 60,000, against Marcellus's 20 to 25,000. Upon approaching the walls of Nola, Hannibal first tried negotiation, sending Hanno to parley with two local senators. Hanno went on with a big speech. "If the Romans are so good, how come we are besieging you, huh? Even if both consuls were here, they would not be enough to defend you. What is one former praetor going to do against mighty Hannibal? Remember what happened to Nuceria, and remember what happened to Capua. You have two choices. You either join us like Capua, or you die like Nuceria. So, will you switch sides and join us, the great Carthaginian Empire?" To which the senators shortly replied, "If the thought of negotiating with you even ever crossed our minds, why would we ever ask the Romans to come help us defend the town?" Receiving the rejection, Hannibal started to prepare for a siege. Now, what do you think the upcoming battle would be like? Do you think A, Hannibal approaches the walls not expecting a sally but gets one anyway and then is surprised, or B, literally anything else happens? I'll give you 4 seconds to think about it. That's right, no tricks this time. A is the correct answer. Hannibal fell for it for the 4th time. As soon as the Golem army approached the gates, Marcellus gave the signal, and the Roman army came rushing out, surprising the Golem and pushing it back. At this time, gods themselves got tired of the same shit, so they sent a horrid rain that forced both sides to retire. Next day, Marcellus, probably bored himself, deployed for battle outside the city walls. This was the first time since Cannae that anyone directly challenged Hannibal, so he obviously wasn't going to let this opportunity go unused. He accepted the challenge and ordered his troops to charge. Marcellus had the advantage here. Even though his units were newly raised and had barely seen any combat, they were still organized in the Roman fashion. No matter how fresh the troops were, the doctrine was so superior that when it came to infantry engagements, there was no match for the legions. Just like there was no match for the Numidian cavalry. But you know what else wasn't there for the Numidian cavalry? Space. Because the battle was in front of the city walls, there was no chance for Hannibal's horsemen to pull off a flanking maneuver, and they obviously wouldn't charge head-on into infantry because they weren't stupid, supposedly. You beat them yesterday, only for them to be saved by rain. Before that, a slave army beat them at Cumae. Last year, I defeated them with disgraced survivors of Cannae. Soldiers, these are not the men who slew Paulus and Flaminius. These are not the men that crossed the Alps and the Apennines. These are gooners, betrayed by their own vices at Capua this last winter, one-shotted by luxury that they had never tasted before. Men, Capua was Hannibal's Cannae. He really said all this, by the way, while Marcellus was busy encouraging his men by insulting Hannibal's soldiers. Hannibal was busy, insulting Hannibal's soldiers. I recognize the banners you men are holding, but I do not recognize the men holding them. Where is the Gaul that killed Flaminius with such vigor? Where are the Iberians that held the line at Cannae? All I see are filthy gooners holding the standards of my men. As you can see, people living more than 2,000 years ago knew how damaging it was to a man to be comfortable. And they weren't wrong either, as Hannibal's men were pushed back along the whole line. Seeing the writing on the metaphorical and the literal wall, Hannibal ordered them back into the camp, before everything turned into a complete disaster. Marcellus mined a pure gem here. Hannibal lost 5,000 men and 4 elephants, alongside 600 soldiers and 2 praetors captured, with about 1,000 dead on the Roman side. Next day, 300 Spanish and Numidian horsemen deserted to the Romans. This was extremely dangerous. If Hannibal lost his cavalry wing, he would be fucked. He abandoned Nola once more, sent Hanno back to Bruttium with his 20,000 men, and made his way to Apulia, leaving both Campania and Samnium to Romans. This was a disaster. In less than a year, Hannibal went from Cannae to having to abandon his biggest allies. Hannibal being gone from the region was such a happening that even Fabius Maximus himself started doing something. He set about raiding the Capuan countryside. The Italians knew very well that they couldn't do jack shit to stop this, so they just watched from their cock ramparts as Romans burned whatever they could. One Capuan horseman who was known as the best rider in all of Campania actually didn't want to be a cock. Ironically enough, his name was Toria, or the Bull. He galloped to Fabius's camp and rode up and down the perimeter. A silence fell, as it would be dishonorable to kill a lone knight. It was clear that he was looking for a duel. "Asellus, where are you?" Suddenly the bull shouted. Claudius Asellus was a Roman equite who equaled the bull in his reputation. "You used to dispute with me about our valor. Why do you not show yourself now?" Claudius asked the consul if he was allowed to accept the challenge. To which he got a prompt reply: "Go, as it is known by all that nothing ever happens anyway." Soon, a crowd had formed, Capuans watching from their walls and the Romans from their camp. "Bull? More like cock, reditor!" The knights exchanged insults and charged at each other. Every asshole in the vicinity was puckered with anticipation.
Damn you! Coward! You bastard! Murder dog!
Anticipation soon turned to boredom though, as the riders only wheeled around each other and engaged in scarce clashes. Nothing was happening. "I spoke of this," a deafening voice rang out in the field. The consul was gloating in yet another of his predictions coming true. Toria, not wanting to give satisfaction to the enemy commander, yelled out, "Come now, Claudius, this will only be a test of our horses, as both of us are experienced enough not to do anything foolish, unless we go into that." He pointed towards a ditch that was so narrow that the only way for them would be forward. Thus death would be unavoidable. He had not even finished his words when Claudius had already jumped in the ditch with his horse. Seeing such bravery, Toria lost heart. He gulped the iconic gulp and ran back into the city. Yet again, nothing happened. "I spoke of this!" The words themselves were soft, but they were heard better than a thunderstrike. Enraged by the sheer irony of a man named the Bull cocking out of his own duel, Claudius flew out of the ditch with his steed and ran after the Capuan. The spectacle was so shocking that the guards of the city did not even think about closing the gate. Claudius thundered in. No one knew what was happening inside. "My consul, surely he will be killed. We must help him," cried the centurion. Nothing ever happens. Minutes, which felt more like days, passed, and Claudius emerged from the opposite gate, slowly galloping back to the camp. Disappointment on his face was so immeasurable that it was showing through his rider's mask. His compatriots excitedly ran up to him, every single one of them tripping over not only each other, but their own words. "Equitus, are you alright? Did they harm you? Did you find the bull? Did you kill him? Damn it, man, tell us what happened."